The run-up to Christmas is always a bit of a strange time of year in any form of media, and the main reason for that is because within the space of around 2 to 3 months, you have a number of major cultural events happening. You have Halloween at the end of October, then you have, in the UK, Bonfire Night, in America, Thanksgiving, you have Christmas, you have New Year's, and then whatever other cultural events happen depending on where you are in the world during that period. And when it comes to media, they have to kind of commit to one or the other, which is why in video games, for example, in the run-up to Halloween, you see a lot of horror games, and then after Halloween, you'll see a lot of the big-name releases, like your Call of Duties and your God of Wars and other AAA titles of that caliber in the run-up to Christmas. And the logical part of my brain applauds this as wise thinking, good business sense, etc., etc., etc. Unfortunately, the creative part of my brain laments the fact that I'm probably never going to see a really good Christmas-themed horror game. Imagine it. Take the original Silent Hill game, set it in the North Pole, have creepy ghost Santas and monster reindeer all over the place, and then when you go to the school/sweatshop factory floor, you have, instead of ghost babies, little ghost elves with knives who run at you and stab you. I mean, who wouldn't want to play that game at Christmas? Anyway, enough of my Christmas wish list. Let's get on with the show. Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome to Gossy News, where I take the choicest cuts of video game news, season them with a healthy dose of hot takes, and serve them with a salad of opinions. If you like our style of news coverage, then please do click that like and subscribe button, ring that notification bell. It does help us grow as a channel, and we'd like to reach more people if that's possible. Getting into the news proper, we're starting off with Call of Duty Modern Warfare, which I did mention in the introduction. Modern Warfare 2 is the most lucrative Call of Duty launch ever. It is the fastest Call of Duty to hit $1 billion by far. According to Activision's latest press release, the previous record for hitting $1 billion was set by Black Ops 2 back in 2012, which took 15 days, whereas Modern Warfare 2 has taken only 10 days to reach $1 billion. And that is an interesting thing because Sony have been making a big play about how Call of Duty has been a big thing for them and how they'll lose a lot of players if they don't have access to Call of Duty. This has been the argument they've been making to prevent Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard. Microsoft, on the other hand, have been downplaying how popular Call of Duty is, saying that is not as relevant as it used to be. That argument's been blown out of the water, but regardless of whether you fall on Microsoft's side or Sony's side, there is an important bit of context here that I think has been massively overlooked, and it is a major piece of evidence which is more relevant to the whole discussion than the sales of Call of Duty, and that is the number of consoles sold. Back in the first couple of weeks of October, GfK data revealed that the PlayStation 5 had delivered the highest revenue of any console at 2 million units, and that was just here in the UK. That made it the fourth fastest selling games console of all time here in the UK. The top 10 is actually eye-opening when you look at it, with the Nintendo Wii being number 1, the PlayStation 2 being number 2, PlayStation 4 being number 3, PlayStation 5 being number 4, and PlayStation 3 being number 5. So Microsoft doesn't even appear in the top 5 positions for the fastest consoles to reach 2 million sales, and that's just here in the UK. Microsoft appears with the Xbox One at position 6, and then the Xbox 360, then the PlayStation 1 at position 8, and then the Nintendo Switch, and then the original Xbox. So the Xbox Series X and Series S don't even enter the top 10, which means they haven't even reached 2 million sales here in the UK. Now you extrapolate that to the global scale, and that tells you who the real leader in consoles is, which puts paid to Sony's argument that they will lose customers. When you are so massively overpowered in a particular market that even a company as large as Microsoft and as rich as Microsoft barely gets a look in, then You can talk all you want about how not having Call of Duty on your console is going to affect your customer base, but there's been no new console-based Call of Duty games since the release of the PlayStation 5, and yet Sony still massively outsold Microsoft. Now do you see why context is important? Anyway, leaving that to one side, we're going to go over to Japan because PC gaming has long been considered a niche area of gaming in Japan, even though originally it was the dominant form until the rise of the consoles, and it never really went away. And even though it's considered niche, it is still a big area of gaming. It's just Japanese people have preferred consoles and handheld and mobile devices for the last few decades. But PC gaming has still been bubbling away under the surface, and in the last couple of years, it has been on the rise. This is according to a report by Japanese think tank Kadokawa ASCII Research Labs, which they wrote for Famitsu. It has been translated by Kantan Games analyst Dr. Serkan Toto, which I will link in the description below. Now, according to the findings, Japan's population was about 126 million back in 2021. Of those, around 55.4 million people identified as gamers, and of those, around 16 million people identified as PC gamers. Now, to give some context to that, again, as I said, context is everything. Back in 2015, just 11 million people identified as PC gamers in Japan. That means that in the space of just 6 years, the number of PC gamers has grown by 45%. So what are the causes of this growth? Well, one of the main causes, obviously, was the coronavirus pandemic. People were in lockdown. People needed to entertain themselves while they were at home. There's only so much TV you can watch, so they turned to video games. Unfortunately, because of the lockdown, you also had supply chain issues and people couldn't get hold of PlayStation 5s in Japan, and the more hardcore gamers among them turned to PCs for high-fidelity games. That wasn't the only factor. Over the last 6-7 years, there's been a growing acceptance of foreign and indie games in Japan, which are more accessible and often cheaper on Steam or the Epic Game Store. PUBG, for example, was a particularly big driver for Japan's PC gaming scene around 2017 to 2018. Aside from those factors, there's simply more availability of Japanese-made PC games. That's driven by new insights from Capcom and Square Enix and other studios like those that the PC platform can actually be very lucrative. Steam in particular is among the standard launch platforms for many Japanese studios nowadays, something that was very rare just a few years ago. There's also some homegrown PC games that actually have contributed directly to the rise of PC gaming, so games like Kantai Collection and Final Fantasy XIV in particular have been noted in this report, which is interesting because of something that we'll talk about towards the end of this episode. As I said, I'll put the rest of the report in the description below so you can read the rest of it yourselves. Moving on to China. Now, according to Nico Partners, China's games market has started to decline for the first time in 20 years. Apparently, the growth in the PC sector has been offset by lower spending in mobile games, among other factors. One of those factors being the Chinese government's really strict rules when it comes to publishing video games. How are you supposed to publish video games when some bureaucrat in the government can stop you dead in your tracks with the development because they disagree with something that you might have done in the game? Which may or may not have been intentional, maybe it was an artistic choice, but they can do that. That's just how strict their rules are. Anyway, according to the report, the PC and console market has grown a little bit, but there's been lower spending on mobile platforms, which remains the biggest sector of China's games market, accounting for 66% of all revenue, which, if you consider the Chinese games market as a whole, is a ridiculous amount of money. And that might be why Microsoft is powering up their search for Chinese gaming hits in their race against Sony. This is according to an article from Reuters news agency, which opens with Microsoft is stocking up on Chinese video game content to emulate Sony's success with Genshin Impact. I basically had to stop for a moment and think, hang on, when was Sony successful with Genshin Impact? It's available on PlayStation platforms, but it's also available on PC, but it's primarily available on mobile devices, and I'm sure that MiHoYo were the developers of that, And I'm pretty sure that Sony had no involvement in the development or the publishing of Genshin Impact. So I'm not sure why the article opens with that, because Genshin Impact caught everybody off guard. Microsoft, Sony, you name it, everybody was blown away by just how ridiculously popular that game became. Leaving that to one side, Microsoft and Sony have for some years been offering big money to small developers to nurture programs and license titles, but with the arrival of Genshin Impact, Western developers and Western studios and Western publishers, and Microsoft and Sony in particular, realized that there was this massive land of not just players, but also developers, this massive wealth of resources and ideas and all sorts of other things that they could tap into. Now, I find all of this really, really interesting because back in June of 2021, myself and my colleague, who's also called Rob, did a video for our channel called China, the Sleeping Video Games Titan, which I am linking on the screen somewhere here. At the time, there was a trailer that had come out for Black Myth Wukong, and that kind of led us into this examination of China as a nation of game players and game developers. And we did our research, we looked at the number of Chinese players there were, the number of Chinese developers, but not only that, we looked at the number of games that were coming out of China that people didn't realize were Chinese games. Not just Genshin Impact, but all sorts of other stuff as well. And we realized that the rest of the world seemed to have ignored this massive titan, and China isn't the only titan there. India is another titan, Africa is another titan, South America is another titan. These are all massive potential markets for video games with their own culture and folklore and legends and history, things that could be tapped into and games that could be made from those. It's just a shame that the Western developers and studios have not tapped into or invested in any of those potential markets, not properly anyway, and that's because we're so focused on the new Call of Duty or the new FIFA or something like that. You have to remember, people don't really want change, they just want tomorrow to be like today. Cynical nature aside, Microsoft is also exploring energy-saving graphics modes for Xbox and Windows games. Now, I applaud this because it is all about sustainability and lowering energy bills. Here in the UK, we are currently in a cost of living crisis, just like a lot of other countries in the world, and rising gas, electric, food, petrol bills, they've all but crippled the economy. It's the same in other countries, but here in the UK it seems especially egregious because we kind of did it to ourselves when you think about it. I'm not going to lament on this, but if the Tories hadn't sold the utilities back in the 80s, we wouldn't be in this situation now, would we? Anyway, regardless of your politics, Microsoft have made a good move with this. They put out a new survey on Xbox Insider Hub and asked users how they felt about features that would reduce frame rates and resolution, thus reducing power consumption and saving money. Granted, it is just a survey, but there are already updates to the Series X and the Series S consoles that include a revamp of power settings, which gives you a better visual representation of how much energy you're likely to save while switching between power saving and standby modes. If the recent surveys on the Xbox Insider program are to be believed, Microsoft is looking at ways of taking things a step further, which I approve of. Sony, take note, do the same thing. Nintendo, do the same thing, because times are hard right now. Moving away from Microsoft to Riot Games. Now, they have announced that they're doing a standalone Women's League of Legends tournament because they want to promote diversity and inclusion in the esports community. The teams are going to be composed entirely of women over the age of 16. The tournament itself, though, isn't going to be on the same scale as League of Legends Worlds. That's had years to develop and grow into what it is now, but it is a starting point. The prize pool is only going to be £3,000, and the inaugural event is going to be held on November the 26th and 27th of 2022. It's geared towards the Northern European region, which Riot defines as the UK, Republic of Ireland and Nordic nations, though it is also open to players from other European regions, and it's going to be produced in Nottingham by esports production students learning their trade. Now, there are several reasons to applaud Riot with their approach to this, but one of the main things that I want to look at isn't the now, it's the future. See, esports is one of those rare situations where women can compete evenly with men on the same platform, on the same ground, and achieve the same recognition as men. And I am all for that. Anyway, moving on to some EA news. They have at least 2 more Marvel games in the works after their Iron Man game. According to a recent announcement from EA, the motive game based on Iron Man is just the beginning of their partnership with Marvel, and they're looking to develop at least 3 new action-adventure games that will be available for consoles and PC. This is interesting to me because it's only recently that EA lost the right to exclusivity with the Star Wars franchise. And now they're back with Disney Marvel making a new deal for Marvel games. Yes, it's not exclusivity, but that's not the main concern. See, the main concern is live service games make up nearly 3/4 of EA's business. This is according to EA's Q2 earnings call, where executives discussed FIFA and Madden performance and the rationale behind taking Sims 4 free-to-play. According to the information presented by Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer Christopher Sue, live service titles accounted for 73% of EA's gaming business, with digital title sales making up 66% of full game units sold, which is an increase of 5% year on year. Now, the key thing here is the context. The industry as a whole has been pushing more towards live service titles for a while, and the fact that almost 3/4 of EA's business is made up of live service titles is actually quite concerning, especially given the fact that other developers have tried and failed to make something successful when it comes to live service games. Square Enix, for example, famously have failed any number of times, and one of those times was with a Marvel Avengers game. Now do you see why I'm concerned about the Marvel games? Now, there is one title where EA are hoping they are onto a winner, and that is with Koei Tecmo's incredible monster hunting game Wild Hearts. According to EA, what we see the team doing is all of the things the community is asking for in the genre. Now, Wild Hearts is being developed by Omega Force, which is a division of Koei Tecmo, and they're best known for the Dynasty Warriors games and various spin-offs of that particular franchise. The game itself is going to be set in a fantasy feudal Japan where players battle against giant nature-infused beasts called kemono with the help of karakuri, which are sophisticated mechanisms crafted from a lost ancient technology. Players will be able to journey through the land of Azuma either as a lone wolf or in a pack with up to 2 friends in co-op, with crossplay supported across all platforms. But those aren't the only EA-related stories, because they've been granted a patent for a system that changes controls based on how good or bad you're playing, which means you won't just be judged by the people you're playing with, you'll be judged by your controller as well. This is a patent that they applied for in 2020 named Automated Controller Configuration Recommendation System, which outlines a system whereby a game would adjust controller settings depending on the user's skill. This isn't a new concept because designers from the early 80s have been working on adaptive systems to help players who are finding a given game difficult. But given the rise of extremely challenging games like the Dark Souls games and other Souls-like games, the popularity of Elden Ring, things like that, would an adaptive controller like this make those games easier, which in turn would then push developers to make games much more challenging to compete with the fact that these controllers are then compensating for certain mechanics in the game? Is this the start of an endless, vicious cycle between controllers and games? We'll have to wait and see. Our final bit of EA news is that they're dropping Project Cars. The firm is going to stop further development and investment in the series, and the staff affected are going to be moved to other EA roles wherever possible. According to a statement given to gamesindustry.biz, an EA spokesperson said, "Today we announced internally an update to our racing portfolio. Following an evaluation of the next Project Cars title and its longer-term growth potential, we have made the decision to stop further development and investment for the franchise." Now, I'm not going to waste time with the rest of the statement because it's really just a bunch of business speak, which TLDR version just says, hey, we're done with Project Cars, we're going to focus on our licensed IP, and we're going to make a lot of live service stuff because that's what we think people want. So, moving on to the Callisto Project, which has been cancelled in Japan. The horror title has been unable to get a rating from the country's rating board, Zero, and the main reason for that is because Zero didn't agree with the amount of violence featured in the space horror title, especially the amount of dismemberment, but developer Striking Distance did not want to cut any content from the game because they felt that it all played in to the narrative of the game. Striking Distance have announced that the Callisto Protocol has decided to stop the release of the Japanese version. As of now, the Zero rating cannot be passed. We have decided that we would no longer be able to provide you with the experience you need. We hope everyone in Japan will understand. If you have already pre-ordered, we will refund you. I can understand different countries have their rules and regulations. Germany, for example, took years for anybody to even be able to play Resident Evil. They could only import it secretly. Australia has really strict laws when it comes to horror and violence. So yes, there are rules and regulations that you have to adhere to. But this does make me want to play Callisto Protocol even more now. Sorry, but it kind of had the reverse effect. Anyway, moving on to Hideo Kojima, and footage of his unannounced Overdose has seemingly leaked onto the internet. It appears to be a horror game, given the fact that you have a lone woman with a torch wandering around corridors in some building while these alerts pop up saying, oh, somebody's watching you, somebody's following you. They don't actually say things like that. It's just like when you alert a guard in Metal Gear. It's kind of that. But people aren't talking about the game itself. What people are talking about is, who the hell is the guy reflected in the screen of the laptop? You know, the topless guy holding a phone camera. You have to watch the video to understand what I'm saying. So if you haven't, Google it, look it up on YouTube, have a watch of it. It'll make sense. Okay, moving on to Mass Effect. Now, Bioware released an old concept art image to mark N7 Day, and with that image there was a series of noises which sounded to me a bit like the repeating pattern you see in certain films like Contact, where they have a massive information within that repeating pattern, and that's exactly what happened here. Bioware were really smart with their marketing here, and the message hidden within that repeating pattern was decoded by a Redditor called Boundiesel, who worked some audio magic on the video and discovered a hidden message from Liara which says, exactly, the Council will be furious, although they should know by now not to underestimate human defiance. Now, this has left a lot of Mass Effect fans with a lot more questions. Some of them are saying that the image is of a relay, suggesting that we're going somewhere new in the galaxy, and then you have this seemingly cryptic message hidden inside a repeating pattern of sounds. It's all very strange, and I'm kind of loving the marketing for it. And it's not often I say that about marketing for video games. Moving on to Embracer Group and Eidos Montreal, apparently there is a new Deus Ex in early development. The studio has also said they're going to be working on a new IP and co-developing Xbox games, including Fable. That's according to a report from Jason Schreier over at Bloomberg, but that's not where the meat of the story is. See, Eidos Montreal is one of those studios that was bought by Embracer Group from Square Enix for $300 million. And everyone was saying, Embracer Group, yay! But as I've said several times in this episode, context is everything. Embracer are actually closing Square Enix Montreal, which they recently rebranded last month into a studio called Onoma, and the quality assurance team, and roughly 200 people are going to be impacted by this closure. Embracer are going to be focusing on Crystal Dynamics and Eidos Montreal instead, which is basically where they see the future. It's not all sweetness and light. These decisions to buy various companies, they do have consequences. Some people will end up losing their jobs. Anyway, Square Enix were in people's bad books because they announced a project called Symbiogenesis, which had everybody up in arms going, oh, a new Parasite Eve game! But their new franchise turned out to be a playable NFT collectible art experience, which they described as a new franchise. According to Square Enix, the Symbiogenesis franchise is set in a self-contained world where a wide cast of characters, symbiosis, all of which can be collected as digital art. It promises to offer an interactive story and a dedicated community. The art collected by players can be used as a character in a story that takes place in an alternate world where players can untangle a mystery by completing missions that revolve around questions of the monopolization and distribution of resources. I understand everyone's up in arms about NFTs, and I understand that everybody doesn't like NFTs. But I also understand that over in countries like Japan and Korea and China, their perception of NFTs is very different to how we see them in the West. That's a whole other discussion which I'm not going to get into right now. But do look out for that, because I will be having that talk sometime in the near future. Anyway, moving on to Final Fantasy XVI, which is going to be a PS5 exclusive for 6 months according to Sony's marketing. Sony published this new marketing video on Monday, which features Final Fantasy XVI footage along with the disclaimer, Final Fantasy XVI is anticipated summer 2023, PS5 exclusive for 6 months. Now, if you cast your mind back to Final Fantasy VII Remake, that was originally a PlayStation exclusive for 12 months. That was supposed to end in April 2021, but with Remake Intergrade's release in June of 2021, that exclusivity was extended for another 6 to 8 months, and it was in December of 2021 when PC versions of Remake and Intergrade started appearing. Why the 6-month period? Why such a massive change from 12 to 6 months? To be honest, I have the suspicion that it has everything to do with Naoki Yoshida and Final Fantasy XIV. I think the success of the PC version of Final Fantasy XIV, along with Japan's growing PC games market, is one of the reasons why they are starting to move away from PlayStation exclusivity and starting to embrace a broader range of platforms when a game is released. Now, I know that Final Fantasy XIII came out on the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, but Final Fantasy XIII wasn't really the best Final Fantasy game in the first place. I honestly believe that Final Fantasy XIII set the idea of opening up multiple console releases of a particular Final Fantasy game back by several years. But I also think that the success of Capcom and Bandai Namco with their games and their releases on PC, along with the broader acceptance of PC gaming in Japan, has played a part in the lowering of this exclusivity with Sony. Anyway, be that as it may, the producer of Final Fantasy XVI has claimed that the medieval European setting has placed constraints on character diversity. The story we are telling is fantasy, yes, but it is also rooted in reality. Now, this is according to an interview that Naoki Yoshida gave to IGN, which I am going to link in the description below. It is interesting to read. Given the setting of medieval Europe, I can kind of understand the arguments for and against. There are darker-skinned people within the game, especially from that region with the shifting sands and the desert and stuff like that. I don't know how prominent darker-skinned people are going to be as NPCs within the game world. We'll find that out when we see the game. What I will say is this. I think a lot of this argument is stupid because, well, it's a video game, it's fiction, and it's not a finished product, so we don't know about anything within the game. We're only making presumptions as to whether the game is going to have any NPCs or any characters of colour or not. It's all presumptive at the moment. If you are going to criticise it, do it fairly when it's released, when you've had a look at it. As I said, the interview is linked in the description below. Moving on to Gears of War, which is getting a live-action film and adult animated series, sounds dodgy, which is going to be on Netflix. And if all goes well, there could be even more. This is according to a tweet from Netflix, which says, Gears of War was released 16 years ago today, and to mark the occasion, Netflix has partnered with The Coalition to adapt the Gears of War video game saga into a live-action feature film, followed by an adult animated series with the potential for more stories to follow. So, Gears fans, rejoice! You're going to be able to see live-action men who look like they were constructed in shipyards shooting their guns at various but ugly aliens in the near future at some point. And our final news story. Lionsgate Films are flirting with a major John Wick video game. They've been fielding proposals, and they certainly are interested in moving that forward, according to CEO John Feldheimer during an earnings call with investors last Thursday. Despite his excitement at the idea, Feldheimer was hesitant to say much more about the early stages project. I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but we believe there is a big AAA game to be made out of John Wick. We've been fielding proposals, we certainly are interested in moving that forward, but I don't want to say anything more about that at this time. All 3 John Wick movies have been box office hits, and there is a 4th one that is going to be coming out at some point soon. I, for one, would love to see what a John Wick video game would look like. I would love for it to be done kind of in the style of Shifu, where you basically have quick movements and it's all about speed and precision, because that seems to reflect the fighting style of John Wick, the character. We'll keep an eye on this. We'll let you know how things go. That is the end of this episode. If you have any thoughts about any of the stories we've covered on this episode, then do let us know in the comments below. We're always interested in finding out what people think. I'll see you all on the next episode of Gossip News, or on an episode of The Big Slice, whichever comes out first. Until then, look after yourselves, enjoy playing your games, and thanks for watching.